Welcome to the Collecting Keys Real Estate Investing Podcast with your host, Mike DeHaan and Dan Austin. From wins, losses, horror stories, and tactics for optimizing your business, Mike and Dan take a real, uncensored deep dive into the ins and outs of running a full-time real estate investment and wholesaling business.
What's going on, guys? On this episode of the Collecting Keys Real Estate Investing Podcast, we have Rob Rowsell, who is a fellow GoBro of Dan and I, he's another Go Abundance member, and he has a really incredible story and I guess just sort of path to growth that's pretty unbelievable, where back in the late 90s, he was living on the streets, he was smoking meth, he was doing crack, he was doing all sorts of other things I'm sure he didn't even want to share in his bio because they're so off color. And now he owns 1,500 rental units. He just sold a auto repair business. He's flipping houses. He's got all sorts of stuff going on. And, starting from I would say lower than low, like beyond nothing back then. So Rob, thanks so much, man. It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. So, looking at your story, it's interesting because I feel like there's a lot of rags to riches stories that sort of come around, but I feel like not very often you get ones that are like this drastic, right? So, I guess looking back, like the late 90s, like you have it here, you're addicted to crystal meth, you're doing crack, you were living on the streets. Like that whole period of time, I guess, what was your upbringing like? Do you think that even allowed you to go from being in the gutter to where you're at now? Because I feel like, especially now where we live in the Pacific Northwest, especially, there's a big issue with a lot of people that are in that same sort of on the street situation, but their sort of upbringing and environment doesn't even allow them to consider that an opportunity,
right?
So I guess going back, what is your initial backstory even before the, on the streets portion?
I think if I were to just put it under one umbrella, it really has to do with having too much freedom as a young teenager. You and I both know one of the most common phrases we hear is "you are the average of the 5 people that you hang around," right? We've all heard that numerous times. In fact, they beat it to death, right? Well, it's true, but it's true also on the bad side, right? So I was given too much freedom. I was hanging around with teenagers. Quite frankly, I mean, I just go a little bit in the weeds. I don't talk about this much, but when I was growing up, I had really, really bad acne. And I had really thick Coke bottle bottom glasses that made my eyes look huge. And the pimples on my nose were so huge, Mike, that my glasses would sit crooked. So I was easy prey for other kids my age to pick on and chew up and spit out every single day. So what did I do? I looked for the older crowd that also had pimples, and they didn't make fun of me. And I hung out with them. But you know what they were doing? Yeah. They were hanging around on the railroad tracks, drinking Boone's Farm apple wine on Friday nights and smoking weed. And that's how my drug history began.
Gotcha. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that does make sense. And what part of the country were you from?
Arlington, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston.
Massachusetts.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you kind of, I guess, were the, what's the right word? You grew up with a little bit of bullying, it sounds like, and then sort of takes you down that path. And then what was your sort of family situation like with all of that? Because I mean, it's something I think about a lot with kids. You even come from, I know people that come from great families and still run into a similar situation. Was that the case with you, or were you kind of did you have any sanctuary at home as well, and you were just kind of surrounded by this negativity?
It's a great question. I grew up in a very loving home, but the whole reason for the additional freedom that I shouldn't have had was because my mom was a single mom. Her and my father divorced when I was 6. My mom at the time, I didn't know it, Mike, but she was a functioning alcoholic. Didn't even know what that was as a kid. And quite frankly, she hid it very well. She worked a couple of jobs. She made sure that my sister and I had everything that we needed as far as a roof over our head and clothes on our back. It wasn't a bad home life. It was just with too much freedom. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's fascinating the perspective to pin it down to that, because all too often it's easy to simply blame it on your surroundings. But in fact, getting it down to that too much freedom, and then what you did with that freedom is, where you're saying your results came from.
You bet.
Good and bad.
Good,
Yeah,
good and bad. Absolutely.
Good
Yeah.
and
So
bad.
we,
Yeah.
my mom, I was always a go-getter. I've seen it at a few seminars where a gentleman or lady on the stage will ask, how many people here used to have a paper route, right? And you'll see a large majority of the people raise their hand back when there were paper routes. I don't even know if they do that anymore, but for us people with gray hair, very common for us go-getters to raise our hand when that question's asked, because I am one of those people that had a paper route. But as a teenager, even smoking weed and having the freedom that I had, and having dropped out of high school in the 9th grade, I went door to door and I sold newspaper subscriptions on the streets of San Diego back when I was a kid. And I don't even know if it's not too dangerous to let kids do that at 13 and 14 years old anymore. But I was the top producer for that company, and my a couple of quarters running, and my sister was runner up. She would be top, and I would be runner up, and I would be top, and she would be runner up. But I've always been a go-getter. Now, the challenge with my personality, my A personality is, and all go-getters, and addicts, I'll put this as an addict theme, is this, and I sponsor people in the realm of addiction all the time, and it's amazing when that same energy that they've been putting towards chasing weed, chasing dope, chasing alcohol, and they harness that and put it in a positive direction, the success that is achieved in a very, very short amount of time. And that's what happened for my wife and I. Although my wife, I do want to be perfectly clear on that, and I mentioned this in my book, my wife has never done drugs. She's not an alcoholic. My wife did live on the streets with me because I drug her, no pun intended, but I drug her into that lifestyle with me. She was addicted to Rob. And even though my parents and her parents both told her to run like hell, she stayed, and she's now reaping the rewards of that faith in the lifestyle that we live today. It's pretty cool stuff.
Oh, really?
That's cool.
That's crazy. Well, we can touch on that in just a second, but I just wanted to go back to, what you said about the addictive personalities and leading to high performers. And that is such a fascinating thing. And I'm not sure what that is, but I mean, you see that in every sort of, I guess, professional field with high performers, right? Like there's so many tech people that have histories of, substance abuse, or like I used to compete in like strength and fitness sports. Tons of people that are in those sports, they have these addictive personalities that are, at one point were self-destructive because of substance abuse. And now sometimes they're self-destructive because of their obsession with what they do. And it makes it hard to have a well-rounded life because they're always trying to seek success. No, that's interesting that it sort of came full circle that same way. So I guess going from, you were in high school, you were dealing with the peer pressure of your friends that would accept you. How did that go into you living on the streets and getting into hard drugs, and obviously having your wife come and live with you on the streets? Like, was that something that happened immediately after? Did you like sort of kind of stay on, I guess, like the more traditional path a little bit getting out of high school, or was it just like right into the big trouble there? Or was there like some stuff that happened in between? Like, what is that whole phase?
That's a great question. So there were times during my active addiction that I was able to hide it and be the closet alcoholic, closet drug addict. I always had what appeared to be a warm crystal pipe in my pocket most of the time, and then eventually it turned into a crack pipe, and the downward spiral was amazing how quickly it happened from there. But I had a job. I was a functioning addict for a number of years. Most people didn't know that I was an addict, but when crack was introduced, the spiral was no longer paying the rent, no longer paying the light bill or the water bill, having the water shut off and learning how to turn it back on, and actually buying some time for 10 to 15 days on that. And same thing with the electricity. Believe it or not, I knew how to turn that back on, and I did numerous times. And then eventually being thrown out of that house and living in hotels and living in my car. And, so the spiral is a slow one. I will also say that sometimes during that walk, the 10 years or so walk, I did find sobriety a couple of times. I found the Lord. I got plugged into my church. I was being ministered to by some very, very good men in my life, but I allowed the cloudiness of the drama of life to suck me back in and overwhelm me to where I went back to what I knew best, which was using. And this, once you go back, you think that you've taken a break. It's okay for a while. It's not. You end up tenfold where you were very quick.
So I have a couple questions. One is going to be a technical question, Rob. What is the difference between crystal and crack? You said the crack is when, and I understand they're different drugs, but like fundamentally, was it something in your life that was difference between the drug, or is the one drug, the crack, like actually was the step that really helped the spiral, or is it just timing when you say that transition? I don't know the difference.
You know, the funny thing about crack is you can't, the moment you are done experiencing the euphoria of getting high, you need it again. And you're constantly chasing that. And the difference between the euphoria to euphoria is probably 30 minutes as compared to crystal meth. You have time in between needing to redo it again. You know, whether you're shooting it, whether you're smoking it, whether you're snorting it, you don't need to do it every 5 minutes like you do crack cocaine.
Right. It's a chemical difference. Okay. So I'm seeing the transition. Now, my next question is, you said over this 10-year period, you did find sobriety a couple, 2-3 times, maybe. Like, what got you to that point? Like, cause that's pretty hard. And my understanding, talking to other folks that have been addicted to drugs, is like, at first, you don't feel like you're a drug addict, but then once you realize you're a drug addict, it's not necessarily fun anymore. Right. And you always know you need to get out of it. But a lot of people just don't have that. Like, how do you get out of it? And I definitely understand the relapse situation. So like, what was that driving force that pushed you out and then ultimately long-term pushed you out of it?
You know, for most addicts, the pain to remain the same has got to be greater than the pain to change, right? So eventually the pain gets so great that you're like, look, I'm going to die. I'm going to end up in prison, or I'm going to make some changes. I'm a bit of a coward. So I didn't want to die, and I didn't want to be in prison for 20 years. So I says, you know what, it's time to make a change. But an addict has a difficult time remembering the pain from even a week ago, a month ago, a year ago. So it's not very difficult to go back to what we know best, because we forget about the pain that goes along with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons there's such an issue with so many people now. So like, particularly where we live we're in Spokane, Washington, we have a huge issue with drugs and homeless here. And it's one of those things where it comes back to, mental health, and then also being able to provide support for people, like at its core. And there's so many, it's so easy to be like, oh, we just need to like move in other places, like build more shelters. But kind of like you said there, people forget the pain, and that's why they keep slipping into it all the time.
Absolutely.
And then it's made even more complex by things like the rise in housing prices and rise in living, where now a lot of those people, they realistically can't even have the basic shelters and necessities that they need to survive. So then, they probably seek those euphoric moments even more just to cope with it.
You bet. And we are really getting serious for a fun real estate podcast, man. But it's okay. I'm good with it. I don't mind talking about this stuff. The reality is our homeless community evolves around two majors. One of them is mental illness. You just touched on it. And the other one is drug addiction. If people want the help, most communities have programs that will get them restarted back into society. Most of them don't want it. 90% of them are out there because they just don't want any type of disciplinary or structure. They need to do it they need to do it their way, and that's why they're still on the streets.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that as someone who's actually lived that lifestyle, because we go and talk to all of our legislation here, who just like completely ignores that and just keeps throwing money at these things that they think that they want, without ever actually talking to anyone in that community to find out what they do want.
Right.
So you should come run for office up in Spokane, and maybe you'll actually solve the problem.
We'd vote you in. We'd vote you in, Rob.
Well,
Yeah,
they might do a
right.
background check. I might not get voted in, but no, I'm just kidding.
You're good.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, you're good. Yeah.
No. You're also not from one of the 4 families or neighborhoods that everyone who runs the city comes from either.
That's funny,
So
but it's true in most
that's the
communities. You
problem.
betcha.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah. Rob, I want to ask you the question next then. What was that first piece of success that you started building off of as you transitioned out to being, I guess I would call it, addicted to life? What was that? You got, usually it's a win and then another win, and then obviously you took off like a rocket ship.
I was sitting in my probation officer's office. It was an intake appointment. I already had another probation officer for driving under the influence of crystal meth. The second probation officer intake that I was sitting in front of, I had been released from jail a few days before by only circumstances only the Lord could have put together. I put all the details in my book. I won't go too deep on that, but I'm sitting there in her office and they hand me an intake application packet that's pretty thick, an inch thick, and I'm looking through it. And right here is the fork in the road, right? It's right here is where I have to make a decision. Am I going to make changes, or am I going to lie like I've always lied? And there's a saying in jail and prison, don't ever take the probation. And there's a reason why they say that, and I had taken the probation. And the reason why they say that is because the people that take the probation have to do, random urinalysis, right? We got to be checked for drugs, and addicts can't pass those for very long. So they say, don't take it. You're going to end up doing the time, negotiate I knew that if I didn't get honest and go the right direction on this intake application, that I was going to end up doing the 2 years that had been set aside, quite frankly. And I sat there reading the questions, and there was just this, they wanted to know my work history, my drug history, my interaction with police history, my relationship with my kids. And I know I was just overwhelmed with this feeling of sorrow, and I just started weeping uncontrollably, had tears coming down my face, and I knew that this was it. This was a turning point. So I decided to get naked on that application, and I filled out every single answer honestly, right down to the fact that I did have a warm crack pipe in my pocket I had used earlier before this appointment, knowing that this probation officer could throw out the probation and put me right into prison for the 2 years. She came in and picked up that application. She went back to her office. She reviewed it. She came in and very sternly invited me into her office. And she very sarcastically said to me, well, I guess we don't need to do a drug test now, do we? And she says, look, you look like a freaking walking death. You look like Skeletor. And I'm not playing games. And if you want to play games, you might as well tell me right now, let's just not do this probation thing. But if you're serious about changing your life, I'll get you help. And I says, I'm done. And that's the name of chapter 1 of my book, is I am done. You got to be done.
That's an amazing story. So let me ask you this:
really cool.
Have you stayed in touch or talked to that same probation officer obviously she's in your book?
Stay in touch. No, reach back out to communicate to her the effect that she had on the outcome of my life. Yeah. Yes, had lunch with her in 2016 with my daughter and my wife, and Nice. And funny story that goes along with that: when you go looking up your old probation officer, sometimes people will shield her from your call.
Yeah,
I get that. I see. It could go the other way. I get where you're going.
I could reach out to her directly. She had changed offices. Yeah. She's actually moved up the ladder pretty well. She's running for mayor of the city where I had the probation. But she was. Once she found out who I was, I got her a copy of my book. We had lunch, and you know what? She was, because that's a very thankless job. I mean, how many people end up making it through that program? Never mind making it with any level of success. So it's really fun. It's one of the things that I promote to all the people that I talk to is, look, you need to go back and let people know with your gratitude of the effect and change that they implemented in your life just by their example and by their words. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Absolutely. That's awesome. That's a super great win. And I mean, props to her too.
Yeah.
I guess going through the opportunity, I feel like even then, that could have gone either way, just depending on the person. And like, honestly, depending on her on the different day of the week, just depending, like whatever her morning looked like, it could have been way different. She woke up on the wrong side of the bed and she was like, I'm not into this.
Right.
So yeah, that's very cool. So that's awesome. So great insight on your background. And I appreciate you sharing all the openness there as well, Rob. Getting into the business side, obviously you've done a lot of things, and from the auto shop to you own all these multifamily units to do, flipping houses, doing everything now. What was kind of the first step into that? And like, how did you sort of start to build momentum and get respect? Like what was that transition look like? Because that's extremely drastic. I mean, we know people that are very successful, like W-2 employees that can't make that transition. And you did it from a position of, complete disarray.
Right. Well, I'm going to just put some perspective on that. My big goal when I got out of that 30-day rehab, which that probation officer, first she got me into that rehab. I'll tell you that part of the story. Spent 30 days there. I got out, and by, again, a series of circumstances only God could have put together, I ended up with and I go through those details in my book. I ended up with a job as back in my field as a service advisor. I'm the guy that calls you and tells you that your water pump is bad and how much it costs to fix it. So don't throw darts at me, but I'm that guy, right?
And, you're the messenger,
right. and I get your approval, and basically it's a sales position. But at the time, I didn't have all the chiclets back in my face yet. I was pretty toothless. I still looked like Skeletor. I just spent 45 days off the crack, so I didn't think anybody would ever hire me for that job. But again, excuse me, let me grab a water.
Yeah, you're right.
But again, sometimes we make plans and God laughs. My biggest goal back then was to have a phone bill in my name. Believe it or not, that was my big goal. And as I sat in the car as a passenger, because I didn't have a driver's license, the state of Arizona wouldn't give me a driver's license until I paid back $15,000 in fines and went to a DUI impact class and had an SR-22. I mean, the hurdles, and I named them all in the book, but the hurdles were just insurmountable. I'm sitting in the passenger seat. My wife, God bless her with her patience, had driven me to work on my first day at work, and I was scared to death to go inside. I was scared to death to even go back to this thing we call a job, guys. And little did I know that the Lord had chosen the place I needed to work, chosen the employer I needed to work for, and I worked for that gentleman, and his name is Richard Broadwater, for the next 5 years, and he mentored me by example on how to run a successful, ethical auto repair shop. That was the very last W-2 job I ever had.
Wow. Nice. Wow. That's great. Yeah. So then you ran that job, and then did you end up taking over that auto repair shop, or did you go and start your own?
I would go to California. That's what most Arizonians do to escape the heat during the summertime. And my parents lived in San Diego, so we'd go over there. And another cool story, when I first got sober, my parents, they had a trailer out behind their home. They had a beautiful piece of property, few acres, and they had a guest bedroom, a couple of them. But my wife and I, we weren't allowed to stay in that guest bedroom just yet because there wasn't much trust just yet on whether Rob actually got recovery this time. So we stayed in that trailer on the back of their property. 5 years later, now I'm visiting my folks. My father's seeing us come up. He's seeing me run a business for this other gentleman. And 5 years later, 3 years later, my father told me, look, I've got a friend. He owns an auto repair shop. He does what you do. Let's take a drive by. We'd drive by there, and I would look at it. And I would sit there and go, oh, because it was like Taj Mahal compared to the shop that I ran. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful store. Yeah. But his associate friend would bleed on him and say, because he had 5 sons, and his exit strategy was his sons taking over the business, him owning the real estate, receiving the rents, and one at a time they all tapped out and said, we're not interested. And the one guy that was interested didn't have the business sense to run the business, I found out, but I didn't know that at the time. So my father told me that story, and I said, hey, tell him that your son does this, and that if he's ever interested in selling, let you know. Right. Well, 2 years went by. I never even thought a second thing about it. But one day at work, I'm in my fifth year working for Richard, and my father called and said, Sterling is ready. And I said, who is Sterling? And he said, Sterling owns that auto repair shop. And I said, what?
Yeah.
And I had so many things going on. The Lord had blessed me. I had sponsored 5 people in recovery and made a commitment to bring them to a year's sobriety. I had started a ministry that goes around to different recovery homes and picks people up and brings them to church. I just had so much going on. I had just bought a home with a 1-year prepayment penalty that was $12,000, and that $12,000 might as well have been $1 million, because there was no way I was going to be able to pay that prepayment penalty back in that day. And so I'm thinking all these things in my head. There's no way. But I got on a plane and I went over and I looked at this business. I spent a couple of days, and I saw how his son treated customers, and I saw a gold mine. And we were able to, long story short, I'll speed up the story. I bought that auto repair shop, no money down. But here's the rest of the story. This was right after Thanksgiving, 2003. So you're talking the end of November. The caveat was he wanted to close by December 31st. Okay. So I literally put a renter in my home, put everything in the home that had the $12,000 prepayment penalty on it, put everything I owned into a moving truck, moved to California, slept in a spare room of my sister's with my wife while we took over our first business. We did buy it, no money down. It was $150,000. He financed $100,000. My father financed $50,000, gave us $10,000 to get going. And it was a no money down deal for us. And that was us starting our first business.
Nice. Wow. And that's great, because that's your introduction to your first business, and also your introduction as a real estate investor, because you said that you kept your home as well. So you also have, you now have passive income coming in from this asset that you were able to keep. Great. No, that's great. That's, I mean, that, to me, from what I've heard, that's almost like the point where financially and just like hard direction, I guess, into entrepreneurship completely turned around, was in that moment, because you have what everyone kind of seeks. You now have the active opportunity and growth from this business that you just purchased. You now have the passive income and investment from your rental property, and you're gonna, you probably didn't even realize at the time, but that's where the start of the hockey stick starts.
Yeah, that's where the start of the hockey stick starts. Right? Yes.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So you said one thing I wanted to pull thread on is that you saw how the owner's son treated customers, and it was a gold mine. What did you see in that? What was the gold mine opportunity that you observed?
Well, in our business, every business has its KPIs. In our business, it's all about car count, ticket average, right? So if a car comes in for an oil change and that's all it gets, that's financial suicide. When it needs tires and it needs a fuel filter because it has 80,000 miles and it's never been changed, it needs filters. So they weren't inspecting cars. They had an enormous amount of car count because it was the only show in town. And so all we needed to do is just put some systems and processes in place. And that's what I saw was a gold mine. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And not to
not
to mention the gentleman that I work for ran a very, very tight ship. And by teaching me his systems and processes, as I said before, I didn't even know he was training me for running my own business, but he was.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Wow. Yeah. So as part of your seller finance 0% down, did he have any sort of involvement in the business at that point, or were you able to come in and just implement all of your own systems? Like, did he basically just want to sell it on terms and you paid him a monthly payment and he just exited that way, or was he still involved?
Yeah, his $100,000, we paid him 8% simple interest. We had 18 months to pay him off. And nice. We wrote him a $100,000 check 12 months later.
Wow. That's amazing.
So cool.
That's so cool. Yeah.
I want to mention maybe before we transition to the next step is what's incredible, just going back in your story. I don't believe in luck, and you have mentioned, the grace of God putting you in these spots, but going back to where you were sitting in the car going back to your W-2 job and you were scared. I mean, how many people, Mike and I, we work with a lot of new investors that get scared to do things. Everybody gets scared of something, but instead of walking away, which you could have done, which a lot of people would have done, you went in there for 5 years, which prepared you for this next opportunity, which ultimately you put yourself out there, said, hey, if he ever wants to sell this thing, I'm around. You were putting yourself in these positions and you didn't walk away and you weren't scared. You were somewhat fearless, I would say, in the face of adversity. And that's pretty incredible, just to take note of that, because like I said, a lot of times, all too often, we get scared as people and we back down and we choose not to put ourselves in a position.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
So
that's a good point.
Yeah. Especially because you had a position of, I guess I would say, comfort, right? And I mean, not necessarily productive comfort in terms of the addiction. I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of people, they sort of get back on track and they fall off, is because it's uncomfortable and they are scared. And even though that addiction is destructive, I mean, it is, more comfortable to them to be in that position. And, ultimately that's not too different than like people that have, like, I would say like golden handcuffs or those sort of things. And they're really miserable and they're in a really bad space and they want to make a change, but they can't because they're addicted to that comfort. And that's why I see so many people who like start these endeavors, but then they, fail and go back to their job or things like that. I mean, it's all, that is a universally relatable thing, I think, is overcoming that fear, which is really challenging.
It's not
and easy. I had one other motivator, guys, and I'll just be completely transparent with you. I knew that this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back if I didn't get out of that car and get inside that shop and at least try, because my wife was ready to go. I was 30, 40, 45 days sober, and it was time to poop or get off the pot. And I was sitting outside of a place of the job that had fallen in my lap. And if I didn't take action, there was going to be a problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a big motivator right there for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome. So you've paid off this business. You said you wrote him $100,000 check 12 months later. And now, I said that was what, probably 2004?
2005, yes.
2005, okay. So what's the next sort of phase? Because obviously, as you grew it into several auto repair shops. You started investing in property. You started flipping houses. How did all of that stuff sort of like come to fruition? Because those are some different hats there as well. So like, did you... Like at that point, did you kind of have a little bit of a taste for real estate because you had this rental property? So you went to that right away. Did you focus on the auto repair shops for a while and then start doing real estate more recently? Like how does
I'm going to go back just a little bit. When I was working for that gentleman running his auto repair shop, was sitting at home, and some of us with a few gray hairs remember a name by the name of Carleton Sheets. Carleton Sheets had infomercials all weekend long that went about an hour, and I would watch the same one over and over and over again, just drooling, watching these students of his that were picking up properties. And I knew real estate was going to be where it was at for me eventually. But I had one problem. I didn't have a credit card and I didn't have $500. And the only way you could buy his course was from his infomercial was a $500 credit card. So over time, one day in the mail, I got some invitations for a secured credit card. I actually got 3 from the same company in the same week. All of them were $300. So that's you. For those of you that don't know, you send them $300, and now you've got their credit card. You're working off of your cash. And I used 2 of those credit cards when I finally had enough money on there to buy Carleton Sheets' course. And I listened to those CDs until the words wore off. If he got sick and had laryngitis, I could have given his dang course. I knew that thing so well, man. I just memorized that stuff. But I was driving around. I didn't have a license. So the way I got to work, once I started coming up, was on a motorized skateboard with a seat. If you could picture that, I drove 6 miles one way. I went to all my 12-step meetings. You could hear me coming from a mile away on that little thing. So I'm going around for FSBOs, for sale by owners, following Carleton Sheets' course on a skateboard with a seat and a motor with no teeth, trying to buy your house. I didn't buy any houses. I don't know why, but I didn't buy any houses back then, okay? But I had the seeds planted in me for real estate. Now let's fast forward back to where we were in the story. I'm coming up in the auto repair shops, and Claudia and I, when you got a successful business, for those of us that own businesses, we have a phrase called stacking cash, right? Your business is throwing off cash and doing well. And we see a lot of that in the GoBundance family, like a lot of business owners, and they're investing in other people's real estate deals because it makes, they have a place to put their money. I didn't really understand how all that worked back then. So I had seen I had read the book, Robert Kiyosaki's book. Now, I'm a little bit unconventional. I didn't know that his series of books actually supposed to go in order. I was just standing at the bookstore one day and I saw the title, Retire Young, Retire Rich. And I thought, whoo, that looks good. So I took that off the shelf. We were on a weekend trip to Vegas. I could not put that book down. And then I discovered Rich Dad, Poor Dad and the Cash Flow Quadrant and all his other books. But I went to his website and there was free resources there, and they started emailing me, and they emailed for some real estate classes. Free. We know there's nothing free, and I knew that too. So I took my wife because I knew there was going to be something to buy. And I went, and it was a $500 3-day, best $500 I ever spent in my life. I did the $500 three-day, knowing that they were going to have an upsell at the end of it. They did. It was anywhere from $20,000 to $45,000. We spent $27,000, and we learned how to flip houses, probate, wholesaling, and all the strategies that we started using in our buy, fix, sell business. In 2007 is when I started taking those classes. In 2009, we were inducted into that school's Hall of Fame. And because of our accomplishments in real estate and what we had accomplished in 24 months, this was a side gig, if you will. Just over my left shoulder, you can barely see it, but that's a photo of my wife and I on stage with Kim and Robert Kiyosaki getting our Hall of Fame inductee award. And then on the stage in Orlando at that Hall of Fame induction ceremony was a guy jumping around the stage by the name of Dave Lindahl, who has a multifamily school called RE Mentor. Back in that day, there was no Rod Cleefs and Michael Blancs and all the other ones that are doing it now. There was one, and that was Dave Lindahl from RE Mentor. And over my other shoulder there, you can see my wife and I on stage with Dave Lindahl getting our Hall of Fame inductee there in 2018. So yeah, that was our introduction into real estate. While we did, and we probably would have went a whole lot faster in the real estate, even though we did go on a fast track and redirected those negative vibes that I had in drug addiction towards some positive stuff. We also started scaling we started using those same principles we were learning in real estate in our businesses. I got my second auto repair shop in 2010. My third was 2014. My fourth was 2018, and my fifth was 2020.
Wow. Awesome. Wow. So that's a wild story, because you basically were inducted into the Hall of Fame between 2007 and 2009, or for your performance, which is typically when most people are getting their ass handed to them and walking away from the real estate industry. That's crazy.
And the
That's
funny
wild.
thing is, Dan, I'll tell you, we're kind of in that market right now, and it brings back memories, because back in 2007, real estate was a dirty word. Nobody wanted real estate. So when we were buying houses and we were figuring out what the after repair value was, we were taking 10% off of today's value for 3 or 4 months from now when I went back to market. That's the environment we were flipping houses in.
Yeah.
Yes. Crazy.
Totally
and that's where we are now, right? We're kind of underwriting houses the same way.
I agree. That's how we're having to underwrite them as well. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. How the hell did you manage all that? And especially with your background, it's not like you were showing up with an MBA and, knowing how to manage a team. Like, you must have had team members around you, I'm sure. But how did you keep track of all those different KPIs and processes and scaling those different endeavors?
That's a great question. I had a manager at my store, and my wife and I, we work as one. My wife and I are a team, not just in marriage, but in life and in business. And I honestly believe, Mike, that one can touch 1,000 and two can touch 10,000. And I have done that over and over and over again because of my wife and I being like-minded and working as a team.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing.
Awesome. Yeah. That definitely helps for sure. Do you find that, maybe a little personal here, with that relationship with your wife? I know there's a lot of people that pursue that, and that actually becomes a challenge because that sort of becomes your relationship, right? Mm-hmm. Is your work and your business. Has that ever caused any problems on either side of it? Because it's with a lot of us, so Dan and I, we both are in situations where our wives are very much removed from our businesses. So, me and Dan are basically like work spouses, to be honest. We used to hang out as couples, and we can't anymore because me and Dan just talk business, and our wives are like, fuck this. This is like fun for everybody. It's not fun for anybody.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But we can disconnect from it and, go hang out with our wives and do other things. But if you guys are so in touch with that with every single aspect of your life, like, were there ever challenges with that? Like, was it just easy for you guys?
There's always challenges with that. And I will tell you the analogy. There's two things that will test a marriage. One of them is when a wife and husband try to back a 40-foot motorhome with the wife acting as a spotter, right? That's test number one.
Yep.
And test number two is working 8 to 10 hours a day in a business together, right? I'm happy to say my marriage has survived both of those tests. But you know what? In the beginning, quite honestly, I think my wife walked off the job at least twice a week. And I'm not, when she was running an office and running my auto repair shop office, she had never been in the automotive industry. So this is husband training wife. That doesn't go well some days, right? So, we've just learned when to let it go. We've learned that how to play fair. And we've also learned what each other's strengths and weaknesses are. And she makes up for my weaknesses, and I do the same for her.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's perfect. Great. I mean, all about teamwork and communication at its core. It says what it sounds like.
I'm glad there was some honesty there, that it wasn't all roses the whole way around. I'm glad to hear that. But your wife, it sounds like a very strong woman. I mean, just from the beginning and sticking with you all the way through the addiction and homelessness and all that. She's got to be an incredible lady.
She's an incredible lady. I will tell you, chapter 6 of my book is titled, "You Won't Always Feel Like You're Winning." And it talks about the challenges that we just discussed and being partners in business. But mainly it talks about the recovery that our marriage had to go through, because even though we were having major success in the business side of our life and other areas of our life, we weren't yoked alike yet spiritually. My wife and I came up from different upbringings and in church, in religion. And the other one was we had a lot of unaddressed problems from when I was homeless, and I don't even know if I mentioned this. The second probation officer's office that I was sitting in was for domestic violence. So we had issues that had never been. So it took a whole lot of therapy and marriage retreats and some marriage mentors in our life that changed our lives and really made our marriage what it is today. And I don't know many marriages that are much better, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Yeah, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, so we're coming up on time here, but I wanted to touch on one sort of, I guess, like the end of the story with sort of where you're at now. So I guess at the end of the story, it's not the end, it's the current.
We're in the middle of this book,
story,
Mike.
Right?
Please, dear Lord, we're in the middle.
You got plenty more to come. Yeah. So you said as we started the show, you actually recently exited your auto repair shops, and you've do a lot more with flipping houses and multifamily stuff. So what is your current, I guess, like, situation with that, and like what is your plans going forward here?
So in 2020, I was standing in the waiting room of my 5th auto repair shop that I had purchased 2 weeks before, and my phone rang, and I looked at it, and my phone recognized who it was, but I didn't recognize the name. Turns out I had met him. We had exchanged numbers at a multi-auto repair shop owner's mastermind. And he, at the time I met him, had 9 stores, and he scaled to 11. And he stayed on to with the private equity firm company that bought him and his uncle's stores as the acquisitions manager. And he was leveraging his contacts in his phone and calling me because he knew I was a good operator, and said, "Hey, man, are you interested in selling?" And I started laughing because I'm standing in the waiting room of a store I bought 2 weeks ago. And I says, "Man, I'm standing in the waiting room of a store I bought 2 weeks ago." And he started laughing. He goes, "We can work with that." 8 minutes. 8 months later, they owned my stores. We worked out all those details.
Wow.
But as you know, along the way from 2009, I'm not an overnight success. It took, I don't know if you heard the year, it was 2018 that I was inducted into the Multifamily Hall of Fame. That was 9 years later, because we just, the biggest I could think, like a lot of people, and I know this is going to touch someone's heart right here. The biggest I could think going from single family to multifamily was going from houses to 4plexes, and then 6plexes, and then 12plexes, and then 18plexes, and now, we closed on 203 units in in San Antonio, Texas, on April 1st. Where so that's a progression, right? So right now I'm looking at. I have a partnership team. We have an underwriter team. We have an acquisition team, and we've actually exited some stuff this year because the market. The market says that we're done with the business plan. We're done as good as we're going to do with it. It's time to get rid of it, right? So, right now, I am flipping houses in San Diego because my son still works for one of the auto repair shops I sold. He wasn't ready to buy a business. So I want to help him. Him and I had a strategy session. I want to help him exit his W-2 job. I have all my contacts with realtors and wholesalers and all the things we need to flip house everything we need to flip houses over there. And so he said yes. So he's doing what I had to do back then. He's doing real estate as a side gig while he works as W-2. And he's project managing our stuff and helping me with acquisitions and overseeing the contractor and kind of teaching him the ropes. I'm going to do 5 houses with him. Right now we have 2 going, his first 2. Just closed on one a couple of days ago. So my goal is to see that to the finish line and then kick that guy out of the boat so he can fish for himself, right? So that's kind of the goal there. And I'm doing the same thing in Las Vegas with another gentleman that partnered with. That was a little bit more of a partnership. A couple of gentlemen I partnered with in Las Vegas, and we've got 3 going over here in Las Vegas right now as well. And I'm just involved with acquisitions and kind of second underwriting the deal when they think it's a deal, and then helping them get the funding with some hard money lined up. But my main gig is really multifamily. We're currently in escrow in 100 units in Texas and 50 in Virginia and 80 in Illinois and 34 in McAllen, Texas. So we're actively purchasing real estate on a very, very conservative underwriting scale and a very, very conservative business plan. And nothing is bridge financing because the near future is too unknown, right? So yeah, we're just inviting investors into our deals and doing the best we can for returns for our investors.
Awesome.
That's great.
I love it. Yeah. It's all coming together. And so with us, the guys in Las Vegas, you're flipping houses there. How are you guys finding all of your flips?
Great question. Right now it's wholesalers. A lot of the people that were flipping have run from the market because look, we just came out of a season where you could plant some roses in the front yard and ask $50,000 to $75,000 more. All those amateurs left the market because it's a little bit of a struggle, right? I'm the guy that was having to underwrite it at 10% less than today's value back in the day. So this is child's play for me.
Yep. Yeah. No, so you're loving it. That's awesome. I think it's crazy. You're not crazy. It just speaks to your experience and your abilities that you basically are flipping houses in 2 markets. Now I know you're not out there swinging a hammer and all that, but you got several flips going on when everybody else is tucking tail. And I just love that. I mean, that's kind of where Mike and I's mentality is like adapt and overcome.
Right. And the key thing is underwriting it conservatively enough where if you got to fire sale it, you're still going to be just fine.
You're still good. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm kind of sad that we're not in one of your markets because I'd love to sell deals to you because we're mostly wholesalers. That's our main business. And we've had to sort of pinch down our buyers list to most of the people that are kind of like you that have been through the ringer before. And in fact, a guy that's become our best buyer that we didn't sell a lot to the past couple of years, he's the only guy that we know that was doing this in 2008. And he's like, It's like, I'm not worried about it. He's like, I did just fine back then and I'll keep doing the same principles now. But a lot of the newcomers that we sold a ton of stuff to over the last couple of years, they're like just disappeared. Don't even hear from them anymore. So nice. Awesome. That's great.
Well, I hope we covered enough real estate on a real estate podcast.
It's a real estate business podcast. We just like to talk about interesting stuff.
Anybody with interesting stories is what we want on here. And you have obviously an interesting story that has just a ton of seasons in it, which I really love.
There's a ton of seasons in it. And like we all just agreed, we're still in the middle, right? Can we all agree on that?
We're still in the middle. We're not at the
we're
end.
Still in the middle. Yeah, exactly. But awesome. Well, to wrap up here, Rob, we have a couple questions we always ask everybody. So the biggest one, though, I want to know, especially with your experience, this is always an interesting question, different perspectives. What is your craziest real estate related story? And this can be like a crazy story. Like, we've told one about how we had a seller that got abducted from a closing, right? So like they were like at a closing situation. We had a guy, talk about how he found a briefcase full of like DIY sex toys. that were made from like Home Depot products, we've also had another guy who talked about how he bought like the same property. He sold a property and then bought it back from the buyer who went into foreclosure, like about 18 months after he bought it from him at like cheaper than he sold it for. It's like all sorts of, positive, negative. What's your craziest real estate story?
I don't know if I'm going to top those, but I think my most interesting story was top story for me was, I'm a good student, and they told me to put magnetic signs that says "We buy houses" on the side of my house. On the side of my cars. And I got to tell you, man, I own an auto repair shop in this teeny weeny little community where I'm known as the auto repair guy. The last thing in the world I wanted to do was put magnetic signs on the side of my car, but I listened and I did it. Well, I'm driving through town on my motorhome, going home, pulling my Suburban with the "We Buy Houses" signs on it. And I think there's a guy tailing me. And I think he might even be flashing his lights at me. Honey, I think someone's behind me. And we get up onto my street, and sure enough, that car is still behind me. I live in a cul-de-sac. So I get out of the motorhome, and the guy comes walking up. He goes, "Man, I thought you're never going to stop. I've got a friend. He owns this mixed-use building, and it needs to. And he's in denial, and he's about to get foreclosed on." And long story short, I ended up taking over the note. I learned I found a private money lender in my town that ended up financing a ton of my flips. But most importantly, that mixed-use building had 3 apartments and 2 commercial spaces. I ended up buying that from him, taking over his note. I 1031. That's one of my 1031 stories where that building and a condo bought a 32-plex and a 40-plex when I 1031'd out of them. Wow. And I stayed there for another 2 years as a tenant of my buyer until I sold my auto repair shops.
Wow. That is a beautiful, awesome story.
Yeah. So basically, let me just rehash that. So you had a We Buy Houses
$10 magnet.
$10 magnet that someone saw and was so motivated that they actually followed you to your house to give you this lead, and you closed this lead. And in that period of time, like that lead became a residence for you, as well as the ability to sell that and buy 70 units, all because of a $10 magnet.
72 units.
Man. 72 units, excuse me. Yeah.
Don't cut him short,
Don't cut me short. It wasn't even the seller. It was a very, very well-meaning friend of his that really, really cared for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. What town was that in? Was that in San Diego?
It was a little community called Alpine, 30 miles east of San Diego. Yes.
That's wow. Cool. Wow. I mean, man, that's unbelievable. That's probably one of the best wins. I think the ROI on that $10 sticker is you can't even calculate that. I don't think there's enough digits on my phone calculator.
Right. So the moral of that story is take suggestions without debate.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And pursue opportunities when they're there too. No, that's awesome. All right, Rob. Well, thanks so much. This has been great. And where can people buy you? I know you mentioned you have a book. Where can people get more information? And if there's anywhere that people can connect with you, please.
You bet. My website is the best way. There's a button on there to reach out to me. It's Addicted to Life. That's the name of my book, addictedtolife.com. And we also have a business community. We meet once a month and we talk about not just business and real estate. We talk about our health. We talk about our walk with the Lord. We talk about our relationship with our significant other and the most important people in our lives, the most important things in the world, not just money. So you can find out. It's called the ATL, Addicted to Life, All In Community. It's all up there on my website.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks, Rob. Well, thanks so much, Rob. And you guys, if you guys want to connect with Rob Rowsell, go to addictedtolife.com. Check out his book. He's got some awesome side stories in there I'm sure we're going to even touch on. And besides that, guys, thanks for listening. Please go leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast, and share this with anyone who might find it helpful or honestly just wants to listen to a super kick-ass story. Yep. So thanks again, everybody. And any last words from you, Dan?
No, I just want to thank you, Rob. I know we only had a little bit of time to touch just briefly on your story. You got a fantastic story, and I'm glad I was able to sit here and talk to you about it.
Great job, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we'll leave it a little bit open for people to go and check out your book and learn more. So awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. Talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And check us out at collectingkeyspodcast.com for tips and guides on starting your own real estate investment and wholesaling business.